All right, welcome back everyone to the deep dive. You know how this works. You give us the intel on what you want to explore, and we dive in. And you've been signaling pretty strongly lately that you're really interested in how the DoD, the whole Department of Defense, is tackling the whole innovation thing, trying to adapt. And, specifically, you pointed us to a pretty fascinating section of the Forged Act, right? Section 320.
Yeah, that's the one. Think of this as like a laser-focused download on this particular piece of the Forged Act. What we're aiming to do today, right, is really unpack this Section 320, lay it all out. What's it trying to do? What are those kind of big picture outcomes it's shooting for? And how might the DoD actually go about, making it happen in the real world? We'll also dig into some of the potential snags, maybe some bumps in the road, and we'll look at some of the ideas that have been floated to kind of address those.
Right. And just for a little bit of context here, for everyone listening, this deep dive, this is part of a bigger series we've got going. We're planning to hit all the recommendations in this Forged Act, the whole thing, over time. But today, we're laser focused on 320, right? This is the one that's all about how they do experimental procurement, the modifications to it. And I think it's really important, before we jump in, just to remind everyone, when we talk about stuff like mitigations, right, or measures of success, those are, they're suggested by the act. It's not set in stone. Same thing with those alternative approaches we'll be looking at. Those are potential, not guaranteed. Okay. So I guess the first thing is, what is this Section 320? What's it all about?
Well, the heart of it is this. Section 320, this part of the Forged Act, it's going in and making some, pretty significant tweaks to Title 10 of the U.S. Code, specifically Section 40 of 23. What's really interesting, I think, is how it's trying to broaden the playing field, right? What the DoD can actually grab for experimental purposes, procurement, It's not just about buying brand new stuff to test out. They're talking about, maybe snagging modified versions of existing gear, like how do those adaptations work in the field? But maybe the most impactful part, the part that's really turning heads, is that it could open the door, right, to follow-on production contracts for this experimental stuff. And they're talking about doing this without the whole competitive bidding thing. But, and this is a big but, it needs the thumbs up from a combatant command. So it's not a total free-for-all.
Okay, so that does sound like a pretty big shift, from how they've been doing things. To really get a handle on this, why they're proposing this now, it might be good to, go back a bit, right? I mean, where did this whole idea of experimental procurement authority even come from? Like way back when?
Yeah, good point. Putting this into perspective, the roots of this, like the military buying things specifically for testing, that goes back like way back to the 1940s, World War II era. And as time went on, that authority, it got more official, more codified. It ended up as Section 2373 of Title 10. That was in 1994. And then just fairly recently, in 2021, they moved it, redesignated it as Section 4823. But here's the thing. Initially, that authority was super narrow. It was really focused on very specific stuff. Certain types of supplies like ammunition, ordnance, parts for aircraft, that kind of thing.
Okay, so very limited in what they could actually do. And didn't I read somewhere that, there were some criticisms, about this older, more restrictive way of doing things?
You got it. The GAO, the Government Accountability Office, they actually flagged some concerns, about that limited scope. Their argument was essentially that it could really stifle innovation. Especially, when you think about how fast threats are changing, how quickly things evolve. It was like, using yesterday's playbook for tomorrow's game, basically. Yeah. Really hampering their ability to adapt quickly, get those crucial innovations into play. Think about it this way, like trying to build, the latest smartphone, but only using the parts and tools you had for like a rotary phone. It's just not going to work. So the DSB, the Defense Science Board, and other initiatives like that innovation.defense.gov website, they're also really pushing for more flexibility. Give the DoD some breathing room to prototype rapidly, test out a wider range of tech. And while the 2016 NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, that did have some provisions to expand prototyping, those core limitations on what they could procure experimentally, those were still pretty much in place. So that's where Section 320 comes in. It's part of Senator Wicker's bill, S-Plan Mo 618, introduced at the tail end of 2024, and it directly tackles those limitations head-on. It widens the range of things eligible for experimental procurement, tries to streamline that path to follow-on production. This historical context is really important because it shows why they're proposing this change now. It's about making the DoD more agile, more responsive to new tech.
So that background is really helpful, really clarifies why this is happening now. So let's get into the nuts and bolts of the recommendation itself. What are the main objectives here? Like, what are the big wins the authors of Section 320 are hoping to achieve?
All right, so there are 5 key desired effects, that's what they call them, that they're shooting for with Section 320. The first one, the big one, is expanded scope. What can they actually consider for experimental procurement? They want to bust out of those old, narrow categories and open it up to a much wider range of stuff, anything defense-related. This broader scope, the thinking is, that's really going to juice innovation, get more diverse experimentation going. Second thing, they're allowing for modified purchases. This is a big deal because it means the DoD can take tech they already have, tweak it, adapt it, improve it, and then actually test those modified versions much more easily. It's not just buying something off the shelf. It's about tinkering, experimenting with improvements, and seeing what sticks.
Yeah, that flexibility of being able to test those mods, that could be huge for, iterating on tech they already have, making it better faster.
Absolutely. And then the third desired effect, this is the one that's generating a lot of buzz, is the whole follow-on production thing. They're saying, you know, if a combatant command gives the thumbs up, you can skip the usual competitive bidding and go straight to production on that experimental item. This is all about speed, right? Get those promising new technologies out of the labs and into the hands of the warfighters who need them, like yesterday. The fourth big goal is to really cut down on the red tape, the procedural hurdles. Those can really bog things down, slow down the whole deployment process. So by streamlining some of those procurement steps, specifically for these experimental items, they're hoping to speed things up, get those new capabilities fielded much faster. And finally, the recommendation is really trying to make sure procurement is aligned with what the combatant commands actually need. Make sure that what's being tested, what might actually go into production, that it's directly relevant, makes sense for their operations, their requirements. So you see all these pieces, they're kind of working together to create a more nimble, responsive defense innovation ecosystem.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like they're trying to move the needle, make things happen faster. But I mean, let's be real, right? With any big change, especially something this big, there are always potential downsides, right? Things that might backfire. What are some of those? The potential negative impacts that could come out of this Section 320.
You're absolutely right. It's super important to take a balanced view, right? Look at both sides, consider the risks. So one potential snag, if you're skipping that traditional competitive bidding for follow-on production, well, you run the risk of driving up costs, or maybe unintentionally playing favorites with certain vendors, even if their stuff isn't really the best, the most effective, or, the best bang for the buck in the long run. Second potential issue, a broader scope of what's eligible, that's great for encouraging a wider range of ideas, but it could also mean, less focus in spending, maybe even some wasted resources, if they're not really careful about how they choose and manage these experimental projects. Imagine, trying to test out every single gadget and gizmo that comes along. You'd get overwhelmed, lose sight of what really matters.
Yeah, that makes sense. Spreading themselves too thin, not focusing on what could really make a difference.
Exactly. And then there's the speed issue. Pushing for really rapid fielding, that's great, often necessary, but it could also mean some tech gets rushed into service before it's really truly ready, before they've done enough testing, and that could lead to, failures. And failures in the field, that's not something you want. Fourth potential downside, that lack of the usual notification of competition, that could reduce transparency, make it harder to oversee what's happening. And then, this one's a bit more nuanced, but there's a valid concern that if they lean too heavily on the combatant commands for that follow-on production endorsement, it could skew priorities. Maybe overemphasize those immediate operational needs and not pay enough attention to the bigger picture, the long-term strategic goals of the DoD. It's all about striking the right balance.
It sounds like there's a lot to consider there, some potential pitfalls to watch out for. Now, I know the recommendation itself, it does have some suggestions for, how to address those. What are they? Like, how might the DoD mitigate some of these potential negative impacts?
Right, so these are their suggested mitigations, ways to handle those downsides. First up, to tackle the risk of higher costs from non-competitive contracts, they're saying, require those cost-benefit reviews, make sure those contracts are still making sense, delivering value, on a regular basis. Then, to deal with the whole unfocused spending thing, the idea is to set really clear, really rigorous criteria for choosing those experimental projects, right? Which ones get funded, which ones get further involvement. And to make sure there's enough testing, even with the emphasis on speed, they're saying set those minimum testing benchmarks. Those have to be met before any tech gets fielded. To keep things transparent, even without the usual competition, they want public reporting requirements after the award, shine some light on what's happening. And finally, make sure the combatant command input is balanced with that broader DoD strategy. They're saying, look, you got to keep strong strategic oversight. The DoD at the top level needs to stay involved. Again, it's really important to remember these are just proposed approaches, ideas for managing the risks.
Okay, so it's not just a set it and forget it's kind of thing. They're thinking about these potential issues. So, zooming in a bit, if this Section 320 actually gets implemented, who within the DoD is going to be most affected? Like, whose jobs, whose day to day is really going to change?
Yeah, a few key groups are going to feel this one. Acquisition officials, those folks are probably going to need to, level up their skills, adapt to managing a much wider range of potential procurements. This whole thing's going to be much more fluid, less rigid. So they'll need to learn to navigate that. Then you've got your contracting officers. They're going to have to get really comfortable with these streamlined procedures, both for the modified purchases and those potential non-competitive follow-on contracts. It's a whole different mindset than the traditional competitive acquisitions. Combatant command leaders, they're going to have a bigger, more direct role in the acquisition game now. They're the ones giving the green light on that follow-on production. And program managers, those folks are going to need to be, nimble, quick on their feet. They're going to be coordinating that experimentation phase and then potentially a much faster transition to actually fielding those new capabilities.
And it's not just those folks inside the DoD, right? Are there, outside groups, stakeholders who might be, maybe not thrilled about this, concerned or even actively pushing back against Section 320?
Oh, absolutely. You're going to have some pushback. Traditional defense contractors, the ones who've always relied on that predictable competitive bidding process, especially for those big production contracts, those folks might get a little nervous. They could see this as cutting them out of the loop, losing those potentially lucrative follow-on contracts. Then you've got congressional overseers. They might raise some eyebrows, especially about transparency. Is this going to make things more opaque? And of course, the potential for cost increases if there's less competition. And then DoD auditors, they might have some heartburn too. They're going to be worried about maintaining oversight, making sure things are still being done by the book, even with potentially less procedural rigor in the process.
Sounds like a lot of moving parts, lots of folks who need to be on board. So, realistically, putting Section 320 into action, that's going to take more than just changing the law, right? What kind of resources, extra things is the DoD going to need to make this work?
Yeah, for this to really work, it's going to take investment, right?
Yeah.
A few key areas. First off, they're going to need to pony up some serious funding for this expanded prototyping. More experimentation means more money, right? Second, training. They can't just throw this new system at people and expect them to figure it out. They're going to need to train DoD staff across the board. Acquisition, contracting, program management, everyone needs to be on the same page, understand how these new rules work. And finally, they're probably going to need more people, more boots on the ground. It's likely they'll have to allocate additional personnel to handle the increased workload, more projects, more complex testing, closer coordination with the combatant commands. That all adds up to more people.
Okay, so assuming they do all that right, how will they even know if this is working? If Section 320 is actually doing what it's supposed to do, are there ways to measure, the success of this new approach?
Yes. The recommendation actually outlines a few suggested measures of success, ways to track whether this thing is moving the needle. One key metric they're proposing is experimental project diversity. They're aiming for a 20% jump in the variety of projects they're pursuing under this new authority. Another measure is fielding speed. Can they shave 30% off the average time it takes to get those experimental capabilities out of testing and into actual use? And finally, they want to track operational success rates. How well do these rapidly fielded technologies actually perform in the real world once the military is using them? They're shooting for an 85% or higher success rate after implementation. But again, it's important to remember, these are just proposed metrics. They need to track these things, analyze the data to really see what impact Section 320 is having.
Makes sense, yeah. It's good that they're at least thinking about that, how to measure success. Now, I was curious, are there other ways, maybe other paths the DoD could take to achieve similar goals? Speed up innovation, get new capabilities fielded faster without going all in on Section 320 as it stands. Like, what are those potential alternative approaches?
Yeah, there are a couple of other options that have been tossed around. One idea is to use other transaction authority more strategically, maybe expand it in certain areas. OTs are kind of a different beast, allow for more flexibility, especially when working with non-traditional contractors, those outside the usual defense industry players, especially for those really innovative projects. So by expanding the use of OTs, maybe just in targeted areas, they might be able to achieve some of that agility, that speed thereafter, without overhauling the entire procurement system, without going through Congress to amend Section 4023. The other potential alternative they've talked about is building a better tracking system, a really robust digital procurement tracking system, something that could boost transparency, make the whole process more efficient, maybe even speed things up. And they could do that within the existing rules without touching Section 4023 at all.
Okay, so some food for thought there, different paths they could explore. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways here? What do we really want our listeners to walk away with, when it comes to Section 320 of the Forged Act?
The big picture is this. Section 320, it's a pretty major push to modernize, shake things up, really speed up how the DoD experiments with and ultimately adopts new technologies. And they're looking to do that, like we talked about, by widening the range of things they could even consider for experimental procurement, allowing them to test modified versions of existing gear and then potentially streamlining that whole transition process.
Yeah.
Get those successful experiments into production much faster, if the combatant commands give it the thumbs up.
Right. But as we've been discussing, this whole drive for faster innovation, more flexibility, it's not without risks, right? We talked about the potential for reduced competition, the need to be really careful about how they spend those dollars and making sure they're not cutting corners on testing just to rush things out the door.
Absolutely. Implementing Section 320, that's going to be a balancing act. Those suggested mitigations, like those regular cost-benefit analyses, setting those really clear criteria for choosing projects, maintaining that strong oversight from the top, those are going to be essential. They have to do those things if they want this to work right. And it's really important to keep in mind that those suggested measures of success and those potential alternative approaches we talked about, well, those are still on the table. They're still figuring out the best way to do this. Nothing's set in stone yet.
Lots to think about. So for our listeners, as you're thinking about this whole push for faster innovation and also that need for oversight, accountability, how do you think they should approach this? What do you see as that most crucial element for success, for making changes like these in defense procurement really work?
It's a big question, lots to consider, and we'll definitely keep exploring this, other aspects of the Forged Act in our future deep dives. Thanks for joining us for this one.